Hi, hello everybody. This is Sarkolata with Architecture Talk Tank. It's really lovely to be back online again. And today my guest is Finn McLennan, and he is working for SOM, a huge architecture firm, which I'm sure all of you know, as a leader in communications, global communications, I believe. I'll let Finn do all the introductions. But I'm really excited to host you, Finn, and talk a little bit about comms in architecture. So let's begin with Finn. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about yourself and also your role with SOM?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad to be here. It's exciting to do my very first kind of live broadcast, at least during the pandemic. Used to doing this face to face, so it's fun to do it virtually. So I'm Finn McLeod. I'm the assistant head of global communications at SOM. I sit in Chicago, which is really kind of, more incidental to what I do now that I work with all of SOM's offices worldwide on branding the kind of entire design studio organization of SOM, which is obviously a complicated exercise. We are an 85-year-old firm, so our reputation precedes us for the most part. Everybody has some relationship to SOM, and they have projects and buildings that they relate to or that they know about us. And so my task is shaping that brand, turning it into something, evolving it, all that kind of good stuff that makes SOM what it is today. And I would say the complexity of it in architecture is that we very much kind of straddle the line between being an organization that people are familiar with in the mainstream and also being a design leader. And so, operating at all scales, from the kind of occasional single family home all the way up to cities that are, the size of Boston, London, what have you, the sort of master plans. And our clients ranging from national governments to individual business owners, small business to the biggest business. And so that task is something we definitely take very seriously, and knowing that in a lot of cases people have preconceived notions of the firm, how we can work with that and kind of call a spade and know that we have all kinds of different reasons that we're known, and more or less helping to communicate where we are today as opposed to how we might have been known decades ago.
Sure. And I think that it's quite a task given the fact that you have so many different clients, because one of the big sort of topics on branding and communications is to make sure that you know your customer really well and basically align your message to the particular customer and their needs. And here you're serving such a broad range of different clients with different projects. So how do you go about it in such a big firm?
Well, I mean, we do a lot of kind of exercises in identifying our audience, right? And knowing who we're speaking to at all times, and making sure that we're very kind of focused in that, and that the types of projects and the region we're working in very much dictate the way we communicate. And so obviously we don't have this kind of one size fits all. I mean, I'm also very fortunate to work with a big team, and that team includes people who are located in most of the countries that we work in. And so that helps in terms of localizing what it is we're putting out there, because from a communications perspective, you don't want to do, one size fits all. So we, we'll often put out, a message in English that's either targeted to like a European or US audience, which then we tailor if we're putting it out in Asia. And the writing is different, the style is different, because we know that the readers are looking for different things. There's a different type of information required if you're speaking to a Chinese audience than if you're speaking to an American one. And so that's really top of mind for us. And then I think as well, the venue that we put this information out has a big impact. For example, in China, we know that WeChat is a far more prevalent tool for communicating than, for example, the media is. And so we tend to leverage that more and lean more on social media, for example, there, knowing that the highest level leaders and the kind of clients, business leaders, thought leaders are actually there, as opposed to, in kind of Western or English social media, we're looking at, Twitter is a kind of fun place, often like an entertaining place, but that's not necessarily where you're reaching the decision makers. And so finding that balance is really important, and being really detailed in our approach is something that I would say, pride ourselves on at SOM, is that we're extremely detail oriented. I'd say this is something most of our clients would say about us too. And the same is true of our communications planning.
That is so interesting. And I believe that, of course, to mobilize such a detailed way of communication. You need a huge team. But what is the principle? You mentioned already decision makers. So I'm sure that there's a lot of research and strategy that goes into really understanding what sort of communication to put forward in front of decision makers, and also, like you said, which platforms and things like that. But what does it take really to know exactly who is the client that you want to attract through your communications?
That's a really complicated thing, and I actually don't think that there is one answer. I mean, we work in dozens of markets, in the kind of like business lingo, which we definitely try to avoid leaning into too much. Ultimately because we're just working for people. We're creating, offices for people, places for people to live, parks, things like this. So trying to not overcomplicate it, I think, is a really important part. But in terms of the way that we reach, key decision makers and that sort of thing, I mean, a lot of it is, and we talked a little bit about this before going live. It's one of these, that Marshall McLuhan quote, the medium is the message, where we very much try to reach people where they are. We know that, we have several kind of segmented audiences that we're always speaking to. A group of them, we have, fellow architects, which is a really, really valuable audience for us, knowing that it's important to be a good member of your community, right? It's really important to be understood, to be liked, to be a good steward of your community and represent it well. We know the academic community is a big part of it, the general public, but obviously clients, it's almost hard to call them one group because of the various audiences that we work in. But we know, from our research and from talking to them, we know where they're getting their news. And for the most part, it's not design press. However, they do also really value the design press because they know that being validated by the design press, being published in the, in the Dezines and the Arc Dailies and the Interior Designs and these kinds of things, also has this power that, you can be in, CNN and MSNBC and all these places, but it's important to have both because they understand that you also want, it's sort of like writing an academic paper and having it be peer reviewed in a scientific environment, where that if other scientists are validating your science, then it must be good. And so our clients kind of expect a bit of both from us, that where they want us to be visible in the kind of mainstream business world, but they also want us to be visible in the design world. And so we do a bit of both. And I think that that's kind of, in terms of the space SOM occupies, we're very much straddling the line, I would say, between, we still kind of, and it's very true of the kind of projects we go after, we're still oftentimes kind of in the boutique category where we're competing with the boutique firms, the OMAs, the Zahas, and this kind of thing. And then in other environments, more in like what you would call corporate, with KPF and Gensler and Perkins Will Foster, et cetera. And so we're kind of in both places at all times. We're both very big and very small, depending on who you ask. So it's all kind of localized. The approach is very much, seeing social media as a brand tool, for example, and not necessarily trying to hit people with too much tactical information, but then seeing the media as a vehicle for getting that message out. And then being really focused on, is this a better story for the Financial Times or is it a better story for Dezine? And like, who are we talking to? We would never put the same information to both of those organizations.
Yeah, so exactly. I think that that is the key as well, to understand really where the message is directed and who the viewer is, and to not repeat content, because people will read, for example, an article and then they'll go and check your company on a social media and they don't want to see word for word or even the same exact content shared in both, whether it's through pictures or text. So it's I think it's very important to have that kind of sophisticated approach to that and understand very well the journey that a potential viewer can take as they read an article, then go on social media, or vice versa as well. I think all in all, like one of the things that you also been talking about, the aspect of being obviously published in various papers, it's to attract all these customers that read the Financial Times or CNN and things like that, but also to keep validating the projects within the architecture community. And I think that those are just really genius takeaways for architects at any scale of their business. And I think that even with potentially not such a big outreach as SOM has, you can start to create as an architect on a smaller scale as well, for sure. Just self-navigating through what you want to publish and how, and just making sure that the content doesn't repeat. So on that note, I wanted to ask you, what would your suggestion be to how to filter what sort of stories to tell about an architecture firm? Obviously, you know, a lot of times I think architects get very into this architectural lingo and they want to talk only about design approaches. But I think it's important to talk about also the outcomes of a project and sort of tell a story from a perspective of a viewer as well. So just curious on your approaches within SOM onto that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I think storytelling is by far the most important thing that I do all the time, because it's the root of everything else, right? It's sort of like a waterfall. Everything comes out of the story that you tell for a project. And it's true oftentimes, even at SOM, I find myself where an architect will and we still do these kind of internal presentations where there is this conversation that's a lot like journalism, where we're like the press kind of coming to the architect on an internal basis and saying, tell me the most important part of your project. What is the thing that's really going to resonate with people the most? And sometimes they tell me something and I say, well, I don't know if that's it. But then in the course of their description of the project, there's something really interesting in there that they just gloss over because they're like, oh, this is just, a part of the project. I've known about this forever. And then I have to stop them and say, no, this is the thing. This is the thing that people are going to latch onto. And of course, that for me is informed by lots of kind of history, talking to the media, and also kind of, a lot of the time, and I'm sure any architects who are listening who have done their own media work will know this, that like pitching the media is just like a trial and error exercise. And so, a lot of the time, I can now kind of refer back to lots of previous campaigns and say, this didn't land, this really didn't work. The media don't take interest in, X, Y, or Z. And so how we can refine that story. But I would say, I mean, ultimately architecture serves people, and it's the simplest kind of way to explain it is that people will use your buildings. They will be, in your spaces, and how are people going to experience those things? And explaining it in these kind of esoteric terms where, you're talking about, high level especially like, and I'm always kind of telling people to avoid kind of the like archi-speak, using language that doesn't make sense to anyone. It doesn't benefit the world to use a lot of kind of high level language that is in most cases intended to create a kind of esoteric barrier in a way for your audience. What you want to do is talk to people who don't need some prior knowledge to understand what you're telling them. And so one of the things that I'm kind of always in the effort of doing is reminding people, who is using this space and how are they going to experience it? Like if someone walks up to the outside of the museum you've designed, what are they going to experience? And if you can't experience that in person, we want to be able to convey that for the people online. And I would say a lot of firms are now building in countries where it's unlikely that a lot of their audiences are going to be able to physically visit their projects. I mean, some do. And we kind of have a mix of that. We just opened this big train station in New York, which as a result of the pandemic, like I have not been able to go to yet because I'm in Chicago. And I normally go to New York a lot, but I just haven't, it's been open since like January and I haven't seen it. And so I've had to experience it virtually, but that's the case for a lot of people. But then on the flip side, there are a lot of people who can go there in person. And so I think the fact that your storytelling should kind of align with the human experience, because that's really the essence of architecture. I think that the beauty of being able to communicate architecture, though, is that you can also pull out little details that people might miss, so that if they one day do get to go experience a project, they can go, oh, I read about this, this use of light or stone, or the positioning of this, this window, this experience that really kind of piqued my curiosity, and then I want to go there. I think in terms of the way that you talk about projects, there is an element of it that our clients, and I think that most architects forget this, that our clients are almost never architects. And so they don't see the world as architects do. And so, you know, they see the world for the most part as business people, depending on who your clients are. I mean, if you're a small practice working in residential, it's obviously kind of a different world. If you're building people's houses, that's even more personal. Like the way that you would explain that would not be about, you know, facade details and fenestration. It would be like, what is it like to live in this house? And I think that we see architects get tripped up a lot where they feel that it's like almost like a requisite element of architecture to explain it in this kind of like ivory tower, you know, this sort of unapproachable way. And, you know, every firm, including SOM, has been guilty of this at certain points. And, you know, it's kind of my job to try to dismantle it, where whenever I get, you know, kind of, especially the sort of language that's like, you know, paradigm shifting, changing the landscape, this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, it's buildings. You know, it's not, you know, you're not building an entire city. So how does somebody really experience this from the outside in?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think that on one hand, storytelling can be a lot. It can be a block, and it can feel quite hard, especially when you're not that good at writing, to express really that experience of the building, and also talk in a way in which is approachable and also understood by the viewer. And I think on the other hand, there is this always this idea of wanting to convey the message and like what the creator had in mind, you know, and the purpose behind why it is in a certain way. So it's all about finding that balance. And you've given us quite a lot of pointers, but is there any specific strategy that you take for telling that story? Maybe if it comes to the way that you build it, or how you focus on the end listener, that maybe could be a great pointer for people.
Yeah, I mean, I think at all scales, it's just important to think about how your project will be used by people, you know, not necessarily by an architect. And I think, although both are really important, right? Because obviously the space would not exist without the vision of the architect. And so it's a matter of marrying those two things. But, you know, back when I was in school, I actually studied architecture before moving into communications. And one of my studio professors said to me, you know, she's like, I wish one of the things that we could do as architects is create the building, and then instead of landscaping the outside, just like let people use it, and then just put the sidewalks where the people go. And that would, you know, it's because it's human behavior, right? You kind of see that it's a mix of what you want, what kind of control an architect wants to have, and also what the users want to do with it. And a lot of the time, I mean, you see this in very real terms in a lot of places where people forge paths where they're not meant to be, and you see all the kind of like the landscape is dead because people are, and that ultimately that's where the path should have been. And I think that you know, we think about that in communications in terms of when we are telling a story and it's not resonating with people, you know, is that because it should have been where they are? It should have been, you know, there are obviously there's a time and a place to talk about the kind of really intricate details of a project. But then there's also a moment where we're speaking directly to whoever's going to use your building in a way that you almost need a third party who wasn't a designer on the project, which in my case is kind of the beauty of it, that I'm not embedded in the design of any of our work. And the distance that I have from the design really helps, actually. Because I'm like a peer reviewer. I'm given this third set of, or kind of this set of eyes that I don't have the context on a lot of the projects from like the beginning to the end. I mean, in some cases I do, but for the most part, I'm kind of brought in towards the end, and there's this question of, you know, what are we going to say about this project? And some cases it's really obvious, where, you know, if you're doing something that is the first of something, the brand new, you know, in the case of the train station we opened in New York, you know, it's the busiest train station in North America. And so it's one of these things where like, this has to do a very specific thing. And it's, you know, X amount of hundreds of thousands of people are going to transit through this station every day. And so the question is like, what is that experience like? And I mean, you can talk about building details, you know, all day, but it's like, ultimately, how is a commuter going to benefit from this? And that is, for me, the really fundamental part. It's something that I kind of have to remind myself of all the time, mostly because of working at the scale that we do. It's actually very easy to lose sight of who you're speaking to. But I think ultimately, if you're an architect of any size, what's really fundamental is that you think about it just as a regular person, and then you can kind of weave in those really interesting bits, where you want somebody to stop and think about some, reflective space or some part of it. You I don't know, put the kitchen on the second floor of the house because you wanted a contemplative thing to happen. Like that can all be a part of the way that the project is explained, as long as it's done in a sort of linear way, I think, that creates this continuity of experience that isn't this kind of like disjointed, esoteric thing, because it basically says, like, at the end of the day, buildings are physical spaces and you walk through them. Everybody kind of walks through them the same way, unless you enter from the back door. Like it's not the internet where there's all these different entry points. It's a very linear experience, and being able to tell it in that way, I think makes it more relatable. I think my favorite architects are the ones who really have a clear purpose, and I think that is the overarching thing. In fact, that kind of overrides the messaging on any one project, which is, what type of architecture do you believe in? What do you do? And how does that manifest in your work?
That is so interesting. I think it's a really great tip to look at it in this linear way and tell a story such as well. And I remember that Rem Koolhaas, he was always doing that and kind of taking it from this cinematic, almost script writing experience of what happens here and what happens there, and touching also on this that whole concept of happening as well. So like how people can use that place and what sort of different experiences can that place evoke. So actually moving into digital, I think that one of the things that a lot of architects might struggle with is that for generations we express ourselves through our buildings and the end product, maybe sometimes drawings and the process around the creation of the design, but a lot of times it's not about us as the creator, and the story of the creator gets lost, I think. And there is a clear purpose behind it, but social media is almost forcing us to blur that boundary, because as we have, social media is very much about this personal touch, I think, and telling a story from a different angle as well. So I find that a lot of architects struggle to really find a way to brand themselves or tell a story about their company that can be more personable as well. So do you have any tips as to how to approach that storytelling through social media, and also how to make it a little bit more personable, so that people can connect not just with your design but also who you are as a person, or maybe your way of thinking as a creator?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. And I think before even tackling the kind of social media question, I think it really comes back to, and I think this is a conversation like we have all the time. Like, what do we bring to the world that really matters? It's like there are a million architecture firms. There are a million ways to design anything. Like, what do we offer? And I think that being clear on what your purpose is, what your value add is to the world, like what makes you unique. It's almost like it's the thing you're pitching people on when you want to win a project. It's, what do you say to them that if you were standing next to a lineup of all of your competitors would make you win the thing? And so, that I think is a really important thing to know before going into doing any sort of promotion of your firm at all is, what is my value add? What do I bring to the table? And I think everybody has it. It's not like you have to be of a certain size or taking on a certain type of project to know that. Firms with unbuilt work can be completely sure of who they are. And I think that's a really pivotal place, because going from there, you can then identify, who are the faces of this thing. It can't be everyone, which is the challenge of architecture. You can't have SOM is like between 12 and 1,400 people all the time. And we won't ever be able to tell the stories of all of those people. And that's a reality that we have to kind of accept. That's all companies have that. I mean, one of the challenges of working with the media is you need to have a kind of consistent face of your organization in order to gain traction. This is why we see firms run by star architects, because the reality is that the more that one leader of any organization, big or small, is seen, the more people remember them. And so that's an important strategy as well. In identifying, humanizing your firm, pick a couple of people who can be a regular representative And the understanding is that they will be involved, like from a public perspective, that they are involved in everything that happens at your firm. And there is really no need to further clarify if that's true or not. But that essentially it's that everything can kind of flow from that message overall, that you're basically, we are a firm that builds houses for people, and those houses are unique because, the first firm I worked at, for example, is this really cool Canadian firm called 5468796 Architecture. It's a really hard name to remember. It's their business license number, but they have this really kind of unique approach, which is that in the middle of Canada, where I'm from, they are designing these kind of Scandinavian, like kind of, different residential developments, sometimes private homes, but for the most part, multifamily, essentially transit oriented in today's terms, developments. But their kind of value add, they know they have this kind of like unique philosophy. But I think a lot of firms, you can look at them and say, what is that thing that defines us? And then you can take that to social media, and as counterintuitive as this seems, the more you repeat that just over and over and over again, the more people will accept it. And I think we know some architects who do this really, really well. There are some firms, Norman Foster is known for like incredible building details. And like, that's not an accident. Both they do it in their projects, but they also are very good at communicating it out into the world. And so, we have a kind of similar set of principles at SOM that drive our communication. And I think any firm working out there can then take that and you kind of repeat it over and over. Because one thing you really, really want to avoid, I think, for any design organization is to be all things to all people, because then you're just, you're everything and nothing all at the same time. And so making sure that you stand for something, you represent something specific, will be an asset later, and it won't stop you from diversifying down the road. SOM is primarily known as a skyscraper firm. I think that's something that we're aware of. We run with it, we contend with it. It's depending on the setting, but it doesn't mean all of our clients are working with us on Sky. We build schools, we build houses, like it kind of runs the gamut. But it doesn't box us in, but it does position us really well to be, experts, particularly when the media is looking for somebody to talk to about something. If you are the expert on, museum design, if you're the expert on whatever, like you'll be contacted for that. Like we get asked constantly to be, to offer, expert like interviews for every network you can imagine, for, what is this part of, how does this work in skyscraper design? Tell me what, how did you do this? Why would you do it? That kind of thing. And that narrative has been really useful for us because it maintains our visibility. And that can be then multiplied across social media.
Absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that topic you touched with, actually diversifying. I think that a lot of architects struggle with that. And I think that the issue is actually laying in communications. So you touched on it a little bit, but I'm going to ask this specific question. Would you maybe have a suggestion for people that do want to open up and diversify from maybe just doing residential to something different? What should they do in their communication strategy in order to welcome that diversity?
Yeah, I will say we do this from time to time, where we will enter into a regional market that we haven't worked in for a long time. And you do have to do a kind of exercise of convincing people that you are able to do it without having a portfolio that can recognize that. And so there is an element of, if you have the resources to do, a research project or something that can substantiate your ideas, or even a speculative design project that you put out into the media. Like if you were looking to create a presence in a specific market, like if you're a firm going from, and there's I'll use airports as an example. It's a notoriously hard typology to be brought into because it requires a certain size. But B, it also requires a certain expertise that a lot of firms don't have. But it happens, you see firms here in Chicago, Studio Gang just won a year ago a new terminal at O'Hare in Chicago, which is one of the busiest airports in the world, and they've never designed a terminal before. And so the way that they went about their messaging, and SOM, in full disclosure, competed with them on that same thing. and we're designing another part of the airport campus. It's a matter of establishing yourself as capable of taking on that sort of work. And so, doing it through, op-eds and newspapers talking about why do we need a new airport? What can airports do for people? Kind of latching on to the ideological value of a project can also really benefit architects, because that's really where architects shine as well, is talking about the kind of esoteric benefit of buildings. And also knowing that, like, if you can do one type of building with the right amount of training, odds are good you can transfer at least some of that. And then for the skills that you're missing, obviously you're going to bring in outside consultants, and that's going to form some expertise. But I would say there's no one way to diversify from a comms perspective, aside from the fact that if you can, you do some of those speculative design exercises, you talk about how you would do it if you could do it. I would say you very rarely admit that you've never done it. That doesn't ever really help anyone. But that you talk about how, we just did this exercise a few months ago when everybody was debating, solutions to pandemic design, for example. Nobody has really done a post-pandemic, or at the time nobody had really done a post-pandemic building. I would say lots of people are designing post-pandemic buildings now. Buildings that are opening now are not really post-pandemic. They were designed for pandemic and are being adapted. So we're not seeing the full impact. But we did this kind of internal exercise across all of the types of buildings we work in. What is the post-pandemic version of this? What is the changed version? And we went to pretty, big lengths, I would say, considering there was no client, no one asked us to do it. That we rendered them in real detail with clear, kind of like marked up, annotated renderings that showed here's what you would do here, here's what you would do here. And in some of these are in places that we are in types of projects we don't do all the time. And then we kind of decided where in the world do we want this to be seen? Who should be reading it? We decided for the most part that we wanted it to be in the mainstream. And so, we worked with The Guardian on a story that was, building better city streets. And of course, they're focused on the UK. So, as an architect, you obviously want to know where your primary work is and then kind of focus your efforts in that area. But that's one of the ways that in terms of, diversifying, we're all trying to diversify into being post-COVID architects and making sure that we're seen as on the cutting edge. And I think every firm should probably be doing that. We did some of this kind of hypothetical messaging to say, here's how we would do it. And we are working on a lot of these projects right now. So it actually is a benefit to our current clients to be able to say, we did this design exercise, and there's nothing, I would say there are a lot of developers who also respond well to this idea where you come to them and you say, we've been exploring new ideas for your typology, for the types of developments you do. And we want to show them to you. And, we're seeing a lot of developers as well in the pandemic are really pivoting their focus, where they used to be one type of developer and now they're moving into, life sciences, they're moving into healthcare, they're moving into these markets that they know are necessary and need more kind of development backing. And they, frankly, there is a lot of money in those industries at the moment. So I think that the more visible you are on a subject, I mean, nothing, when we were competing on the O'Hare Airport competition, we did a lot of this type of stuff, which is substantiating our ability to do the thing we're competing on. And you can do that through social media of your own channels. You can leverage your own channels and say, kind of subliminally message out that, we design a lot of X, or we could do a lot of this, and social media does really work wonders. But then if you also want to be really visible to some core audience, we worked with some of the newspapers in Chicago to do, opinion pieces on why, kind of coming back to the beginning of my answer, why airports really matter. Why does Chicago need a new airport? What are the types of things that you could do in an airport like that? And those stories give you a little bit more control of your message as well. It may or may not have directly correlated to having won a part of the project. You'll never know that, which I think is also probably important for architects to know, that you spend your money on comms, and if you do it right, then it works, but there's no way to fully guarantee that it did. There's obviously a data science to it, but it's kind of an aside.
Yeah. Well, it's just really interesting, actually. I think that it's a very relevant topic to many architects, because a lot of architects struggle with being seen only as one style that they can do, based on their portfolio. And how do they diversify their portfolio? Because a lot of them want to have experiences of working in other sectors as well, but it's not easy to get that chance. And so, and designing your communication strategy and actually showing that you're interested in these other sectors, and also essentially communicating that research online and getting published around it, is a really great approach. So on that note, thank you so much, Finn, for joining me today. It's been a wonderful 35 minutes of deep diving into comms and architecture. If anyone from my viewers would like to connect with you, where do they find you?
So you can find me by, I guess you could tweet at SOM. I'm on LinkedIn, of course, Finn McLeod. And so you're also welcome to email me. It's just finn.mcleod@som.com if you want to reach out. I'm always happy to talk about this. I think communicating architecture is one of these things that, like, if I could teach a class in university, I would love to do that, because it's one of those intangibles, how to market yourself, how to be unique, that is often bypassed, but nonetheless, every architect struggles with it. And, I've worked at small firms, at big firms, medium-sized firms. And so I have a kind of understanding of what the kind of toolkit you need is. So if you do have questions on how to scale this up or down, by all means, reach out. Would love to chat.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thank you as well for tuning in with us, guys, and we'll see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you.